What kind of RAM is worth almost $1,000? None. Zero. Zilch. Well, perhaps if you need a terabyte of the stuff for some god-tier project, or I guess if you think you can make your money back somehow, but the average consumer shouldn't be expecting to pay more for the memory modules than any other component in their system, and yet, here we are, in the year 2026, with kits like this one from Corsair. Only 2 sticks, only 48GB, not even RGB, listed for more than 900 smackaroos before tax. What the actual fuck? The signs have been there for a while, but the first horseman of the RAM-pocalypse was spotted at the end of 2025, when Micron, one of the biggest memory manufacturers in the world, announced that it was closing its retail brand Crucial and focusing instead on direct B2B sales, which in this context is a euphemism for AI data centers. The AI, I guess we'll call it industry, has the same insatiable hunger for RAM that the crypto scheme had for graphics cards, and apparently there's enough money to be made in feeding the hentai and deepfake generators, at least in the short term, that Micron were happy to throw away decades of consumer and partner goodwill in an instant. Worse, it feels like they're just the first ones to jump, and others might follow suit if the bubble doesn't burst soon. What memory's left on shelves is suddenly in very short supply, and therefore far more valuable. This is reflected in the absurdly high prices of DDR5 and even DDR4 on both the new and second-hand markets in 2026, in some cases making memory one of the most expensive parts of any given system. For instance, allow me to introduce the subject of the video, a Corsair Vengeance CUDIMM kit consisting of 2 24GB sticks with a rated speed of 8,000 megatransfers and CAS latency of 38, and a price on Corsair.com of $917 US or 882 British pounds at the time of writing.
Got better.
The original MSRP on this kit was around $350 at launch, and that would have been pretty expensive at the time. This was new technology after all, and that's something we used to care about back in the heady days of last year. CUDIMMs were developed in order to increase clock speeds beyond those of regular DDR5 by using an external clock driver, and in the world of CUDIMMs, 8000 MTs is actually entry level. Modules are available up to 9200 and even 9600 from some brands, and are naturally most attractive to PC enthusiasts who would normally expect to pay a fair amount of money for any given component, but not this much. To be clear, I didn't buy a DDR5 kit in the midst of the memory panic. I wouldn't pay these inflated prices unless it was an emergency, and frankly, neither should you. This kit was provided by Scan Computers last year as part of the review kit for the Intel Ultra 9 285K, which is one of the few CPUs that can actually take advantage of the external clock driver. AMD's 7000, 8000 and 9000 series will all happily use the RAM, but bypass the CKD. And in fairness, reviewers kind of already established that Ryzen's memory sweet spot is 6000 MTs anyway. Now that this particularly niche set of RAM sticks has suddenly become a ridiculously expensive commodity for no good reason, I thought it was worth looking at them a bit closer. I've tested using the 285K on a Strix Z890 motherboard, cooled with an Arctic 280mm AIO, and driving an RTX 5090. Another item on the wheelbarrows of cash list of overinflated items in 2026. Every component except for the AIO was provided by either a retailer or manufacturer, hence why the video is flagged as sponsored content, but nobody's paid me to make this video outside of my patrons, channel members, and those of you who don't use ad blockers. For comparison, I'm using my other 48GB DDR5 kit, a pair of T-Create 6400 CL32 sticks from Team Group, and both kits have been tested at their respective XMP profile specs. This more modest, humble kit of RAM is, of course, much cheaper than the CUDIMM kit. Oh god. and therefore we should expect the $917 modules to be worth paying more for. Shouldn't we? Let's start with the boring but easy synthetic benchmarks. The CUDIMM memory offers 25% higher memory read speed and 20% lower latency than the regular DIMMs, which in Cinebench 24 translates to a whopping 4.4% increase in multi-threaded performance and 0.6% in single-threaded. Wow. Geekbench 6 is a little more receptive to the faster RAM, lifting up single-threaded performance by 2.9% and 9.4% in multi. Almost double-digit improvements. Geekbench AI's improvements are a little harder to pass, and I'm somewhat hesitant to bring up the subject of AI in a positive context, considering what I said in the intro, so I'll just leave the ONNX and OpenVino results on screen. In summary though, I think if you're shopping for RAM for your own homegrown hentai and deepfake generation system, you can probably just buy the dirt cheap stuff. There are similarly slim margins between memory kits in 3D Mark's CPU profile benchmark. However, you probably shouldn't make the mistake of equating this with a gaming test. To that end, I've gone through 5 games at CPU limited settings to see what benefits can be found. If any. I've selected Cyberpunk 2077's Ray Tracing Ultra preset because if you're thinking of spending almost $1,000 on RAM only to play with RT turned off, then I think we need to talk about your priorities. I'm using DLSS performance to ensure the 5090 isn't bottlenecking things, and the difference between the two RAM kits is a whopping 8%. The average lifts from 91 FPS to 99, which I'm sure you'll agree is well worth the price premium. Warhammer Space Marine 2 gets more chaotic in specific scenes, and while that is good for testing CPU and RAM performance, it's also hard to perfectly replicate each time, so I'm a bit less confident in the numbers here. The slower kit delivers around 84 FPS, while the faster CUDIMMs push that up to about 92 for a roughly 9% uplift. The biggest uplift so far comes in Baldur's Gate 3, though while we're talking a 12% increase going from 6400 MTs to 8000, we're also talking about 121 to 137 FPS in a turn-based RPG. So arguably it's actually less of a reason to pay for the upgrade than any of the other games featured so far. I'd heard recently that Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is particularly sensitive to memory bandwidth, and that's very interesting to me as I've been pretty critical of this game's performance ever since it launched. It seems to benefit slightly more than some of the other tested games, averaging 93 FPS on the slower RAM and 103 FPS on the faster stuff. Finally, the numbers are pretty huge in The Last of Us Part 2, passing the refresh rate of my monitor at times. The difference could be bigger than I'm seeing here. The 6400 kit averages 173 FPS to 186 on the 8000 kit, which is only a 7.5% improvement. However, with the faster RAM kit, the GPU is becoming the bottleneck, so I could probably drop resolution further and squeeze even more frames out of it. CPU and GPU performance are always the biggest priorities for gamers. By the time you get to RAM-related benchmarks, you really are getting into the reeds. Even in normal price conditions, the curve of price to performance RAM starts to get out of whack pretty early on, with 8 to 10% performance bumps coming at a massive price increase. Which begs the question, can we overclock normal DDR5 DIMMs to match the CUDIMM stuff and save some serious money? I decided to go back and retest the regular DDR5 at the same clocks and timings as the CUDIMMs to see if... Actually, I'm just blatantly lying here. The true story is that I tested the CUDIMMs first, and when I switched to the regular DDR5, I left the memory settings in the BIOS on manual. This meant the 6400 CL32 RAM was still running at 8000 CL38, and I didn't realise the error until I'd started the Cinebench test. I was just impressed that the allegedly lesser kit ran at these higher speeds with no other tuning required. So I went ahead and did all the tests with this unexpected overclock applied, before going back and testing them again at the XMP settings. In Cinebench, both the single and multi-core results are within margin of error between the overclocked DIMMs and the CUDIMMs. The same holds true for Geekbench 6, and again for 3D Mark's CPU profile, with single and multi-threaded results within a few points of each other. It's also true in Geekbench AI, which, again, I'm not going to dwell on for too long. Onto the gaming tests, and it's more of the same. The overclocked kit actually wins by a frame or two in Cyberpunk, loses by a small margin in Space Marine 2, draws almost perfectly level in Baldur's Gate 3, and despite one small frame time spike, it's pretty much the same story in Spider-Man 2. The result in The Last of Us Part 2 was also the same on both kits, though it was the only game that showed instability with the overclocked memory. The game crashed in 2 out of 4 benchmark runs, so it would probably have benefited from a little more voltage or some relaxed timings. So, after all that, what's the point in CUDIMMs, you may ask? Well, that's a very good question, actually, and not one I'm sure I can answer. In theory, the external clock driver should facilitate higher clock speeds, and it's true that the fastest kits on the market are 9600 megatransfers, while regular DIMMs cap out at 8400, but there's a lot of overlap there. If you're one of the few Intel 1851 owners out there who's interested in performance RAM, I'd say you should absolutely skip CUDIMMs slower than 9200. They don't even seem to overclock particularly well. I only got mine to hit 9000 at CL44, which gave a lower Cinebench score than it got at 8000 CL38, and that was pushed to an unhealthy 1.5 volts. That being said, if you're in possession of an Ultra 7 265K or Ultra 9 285K and want to boost your performance, try overclocking the RAM you already have. It might surprise you. Oh shit, I just realised I've fallen into the trap. I just kind of default into trying to give consumer advice, and honestly that doesn't apply here. Even if you absolutely positively have to buy RAM right now, I don't think this is the stuff you should be looking at. If you don't need to buy RAM, but you want to buy some anyway, bear in mind, most games still run fine on 16GB, and 32 is going to be sufficient for pretty much everyone, at least for the time being. For all its faults, Windows is actually pretty good at memory management, but if you're worried, you should get used to closing unused browser tabs and background apps. And if you're a gamer looking for higher performance, CPU and GPU upgrades should always be your first priority. Notice all my game benchmarks are running at lower internal resolutions than most 5090 owners would actually use, because that's the only way to show the difference between these memory kits. Most of the time, the GPU is going to be the bottleneck, or perhaps the CPU if you play competitive shooters or unoptimized games with lots of NPCs and heavy-handed ray tracing effects. Besides, as most gamers will tell you, a Ryzen X 3D chip is a better buy than an Intel in the current climate, and it can give superb results on cheaper 6000 MT sticks. Which makes this video kinda redundant, I guess. I actually cancelled it once, but I decided I really wanted to rant about memory, and this seemed like a productive way to go about it. With all that said, I know what some of you are thinking. What's Iceberg going to do with this ridiculously expensive memory? Well, keep it obviously. It was provided for the purpose of reviewing new CPUs, and I plan to do exactly that. When some new CPUs actually come out anyway. Also, I might give it a quick test on my Ryzen setup, clock it down to 6000 and play with the timings to see if it compare with my old Hynix A-Die Vengeance kit. In which case, I might use it in my main testing setup. Of course, that would mean I don't need my alt test kit anymore. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.